So this is absolutely an outdated system. It's time.
Yeah. All right, welcome to our Progressive Massachusetts series on the ballot questions for the November 2024 election. I would like to welcome Grace McGovern for coming to speak with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. And Progressive Mass, thanks for listening and caring about the ballot questions.
Yeah, so question 5, what does it do? What does it not do? What is question 5?
Yeah, so question 5 would over 5 years slowly increase the current subminimum wage for tipped workers in Massachusetts. The subminimum wage is currently $6.75. So over the next 5 years, incrementally, it would increase until 2029, when it would be 100% of the current minimum wage. And the second part of the ballot question is that it allows for restaurants to administer a tip share, which means that once we reach, we being tipped workers, once we reach a full minimum wage in 5 years, then a restaurant in Massachusetts may also be able to share a portion of the tips with people who are currently not tipped employees. It does not mandate a tip share. It is the exact same law that every other state has, except for New York and Massachusetts in terms of tip sharing. So we're just following lead.
Yeah, it just allows them to do it if they so chose to do it. And you mentioned the subminimum wage, and so our state minimum wage is $15 an hour. How does that compare with the current subminimum wage in Massachusetts?
Yeah, so the current subminimum wage for tipped workers in Massachusetts is $6.75 an hour. Restaurant employers are required by law to bring workers up to the full $15 an hour if tips do not make up for that $8.25 difference. But that means, which is what we've been talking about a lot with this, that means that your tips as consumers are no longer tips, they're subsidies for the labor costs at these restaurants.
Right, and I have a Department of Labor report here that found that 80% of restaurants, 84% of the restaurants that they had looked at had violated that subminimum wage system. So that, there are some, and I'll just say some restaurants that aren't necessarily following that to the extent they should be, fulfilling that wage.
Absolutely.
And so we've looked at the problems right now, the problems and the way things are working right now, but I want to zoom back and look at the history of the subminimum wage. So the origin story of the subminimum wage is rooted in the legacy of slavery. Could you talk a bit about that history?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to talk about this in Massachusetts because there was a giant waiter strike in Boston in the late 1860s. And that waiter strike prompted a lot of restaurants to end up firing their white servers and looking for cheaper labor, which ended up being newly freed Black women mostly. So after emancipation, lots of restaurants and service industry owners and business people looked for the cheapest labor possible. And Black men ended up going into sleeping cars and becoming sleeping car porters. And Black women largely ended up being servers, waitresses. They ended up just getting tips. Tips had been brought over from England, and they were originally supposed to be a gratuity, which is just an added gift on top of a wage. But once the tides shifted and restaurant owners started hiring newly freed slaves, then they got rid of the wage and said, okay, you can just work for this new cool thing called a tip, and that will be your payment. Also, that means that at the time of emancipation, the subminimum wage became zero. This development of this policy of using tips instead of a wage developed the subminimum wage of zero. And since emancipation, the subminimum wage federally for tipped workers in America has only increased by $2.13. So this is absolutely an outdated system. It's time.
Yeah. And I wanted to pinpoint one other little historical moment because you talked about kind of the origin with people who are formerly enslaved. I wanted to pinpoint another moment between then and now in the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act, which was like the one that established the federal minimum wage. I have a little clip here from Elizabeth Warren about the compromise that led to the subminimum wage that we have. Just going to play that really quick.
When the minimum wage was first passed in 1938, it was passed with a racist compromise. Basically, to ensure that they got certain votes, legislators agreed to exclude certain industries that employed mostly black workers, namely nursing homes, laundries, hotels, restaurants, schools, hospitals, and agriculture. It held back a generation of black wage earners. And that's why, during the March on Washington 25 years later, civil rights leaders demanded that a minimum wage include all industries.
So as you can see there, that racist compromise that was put into place led to this two-tiered system that has gone on to today. Speaking of which, kind of the impact of that two-tiered system that we have, I'm wondering, restaurant workers make up 4 of the 10 lowest paid occupations in the country. In states that have a one fair wage, what are the rates of poverty? How do they compare?
Yeah, so among states that do not practice the sub-minimum wage anymore, tipped restaurant workers have about half of the rate of poverty. It's pretty incredible to see. I mean, it is a two-tiered system that has forced a lot of people to be in really compromising positions. The restaurant industry also it has a super high rate of employing single mothers. We also are the largest industry that employs formerly incarcerated workers. So it's a lot of people who are already facing adversity, who are just forced to be further challenged.
Yeah. So as you said, about 70% of food service workers are women. Could you explain then, I know you've spoken about your personal experiences, but could you explain how under our current system where servers are relying on tips, how that leads to more sexual harassment from customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So the issue is not necessarily with tipping, it's the fact that we are forcing these workers to rely primarily on the tips for their income because it's no longer a gratuity. So when you're hustling and you're trying your best to make tips, you're going to put up with worse behavior than you would if you knew that you would for sure take home a consistent paycheck. I've talked to a lot of women in the industry who just finally get fed up and can't serve anymore, can't wait anymore because they're so tired of wearing revealing outfits or putting on a full face of makeup or doing their hair in pigtails to make them look younger and being nice to men who are being truly disrespectful to them because the customer is paying their wage. And so when a customer is paying your wage, you're going to adhere to whatever that customer wants you to be. You're financially dependent on them liking you.
Yeah, it's a power differential, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I was just gonna kind of stamp as from NPR that harassment complaints come to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission from restaurant industry workers more often than any other sector. So we're talking a lot about workers' rights and about how this will impact workers. In the restaurant industry, there's another side to who's involved. So as you may have guessed, there's some opposition coming from the restaurant industry, which is planning to spend I know at least over $1 million, I'll cite that here, on TV ads before Election Day. So it's called the Committee to Protect Tips, a coalition made up of, among others, the Massachusetts Restaurant Association, as well as some kind of big name, the largest Applebee's franchise, the organization that owns the Cheers restaurant in Boston. And so, what are these groups? What are some of the messages coming from them? Any misinformation, and how do we combat that?
Yeah, I think a lot of their messaging is misinformation and it's fear mongering. The way they've approached this is very strategic. They've astroturfed a grassroots group of rich restaurant owners. It's a devious thing to create the group and call it Committee to Protect Our Tips, but furthermore, it's really misleading to talk to restaurant workers who are, 4 in 10 of the lowest paid workers in America and tell them that they are going to lose their tips if this passes. It's really important to remember that one, the studies that have been done on the increase of subminimum wage show that the biggest effect that passing this will have is putting a small amount more money into the pockets of the people who need it the most. On average, tipped workers' incomes will increase. The idea that tipped workers are going to completely lose their tips or make less money is a lie, and it's a strategic lie at that.
Yeah, it's essentially, CEOs don't want to share their profits with workers. Chili's, the CEO of Chili's makes 271 times as much as the average worker. For Applebee's, it's 64 times as much. Olive Garden, it's 871 times as much as the average worker. And so, yeah, you could see how if we were to increase wages for their employees, that would cut into their wealth. If people support the campaign, what can they do to help?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're doing a lot until Election Day. There's plenty of ways to get involved. If you want to phone bank, we phone bank every Tuesday or Wednesday, once every week. And then we door knock on Saturdays or Sundays every weekend. You can also reach out to me, Grace at onefairwage.org. If you want to get involved on an individual level and give us testimony, or you're a tipped worker and you're just really passionate about it, please reach out. But Yes on 5 MA in most social platforms. You'll be able to find us most places online.
Perfect. Well, Grace, thank you for the work you're doing. I think this has the potential to lift a lot of people out of poverty and to create a more just and equal world. So, I appreciate everything you all are doing.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the work you're doing. Hopefully we have a lot of good change this year. I feel hopeful.
Well, thank you again for being here.
Yeah, thank you.